Venezuela is a beautiful country on the northern coast of South America, once known for its biodiversity, its women, and its oil wealth. But now, the country has become synonymous with repression, inflation, scarcity, and insecurity. To understand where Venezuela is today, it is imperative to discuss why there is such a bitter divide between those who support the government and those who oppose it. The story begins with President Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. Chavez was the president of Venezuela from 1999 to 2013. During his tenure, he made headlines for his scathing criticisms of the U.S., even going as far as calling former President George W. Bush the devil.
Yesterday, the devil came here. The President of the United States, the gentleman to whom I refer as the devil.
He also marked the beginning of a gradual push against the media sources that would speak against him, which today has resulted in almost total press censorship. Despite this, he was revered by citizens across the nation for his dedication to Venezuela's poorest and most vulnerable citizens. He ran on a platform of populism. And during his time in the presidency, he created a host of different social programs and initiatives, all funded by the state's oil revenues. This would later come back to haunt the country. These oil-subsidized social programs provided housing, food, buses, schooling, and more. His followers, which go by the name Chavistas, revered him as the eternal commander, elevating him to a near godlike status. A turning point in Venezuela's history came in 2009, which was the year the two-term limit on the presidency was abolished, allowing Chavez to effectively run for the presidency indefinitely. While Chavez died before starting his third term, he let his followers know that he wanted Nicolás Maduro, the vice president at the time, to take his place as the leader of his Revolución Bolivariana.
Ustedes elijan a Nicolás Maduro como presidente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Yo se los pido desde mi corazón.
Maduro's rise to power came as the country started to enter into its greatest recession in 2013. The country was just starting to make global headlines for its steadily increasing crime rates and shortages of basic necessities, such as toilet paper, flour, and cooking oil.
It's the first time in our country, Venezuela, something like that is happening.
The presidential election that led up to his ascendance was shrouded in controversy as his political rivals, or la oposición, repeatedly claimed that the elections were rigged by the Chavista-controlled Electoral Council, or CNE.
Nicolás Maduro Moros, 7.505.338, con el 50.66% de la votación.
These claims were spearheaded by former presidential candidates Leopoldo López and Enrique Capriles Radonsky. Now, the opposition's greatest weakness throughout this story has been its inability to work together towards a common goal to oust Chavez and his party from power. And this was the case when citizens started going out into the streets to protest the presidential election. Leopoldo López was an advocate of taking the streets and proving through size and numbers that the opponents of the government outnumbered the supporters. This call to action would eventually land López a 14-year prison sentence at the hands of the government for allegedly calling for a coup. On the other hand, Capriles urged opositores to follow the electoral process and the government through democratic means. He repeatedly called for the government to recount the votes cast in the presidential election and when they refused, he called for opositores to vote in masses in the National Assembly elections coming up in 2015. The National Assembly elections were pivotal because it represented the chance for the opposition to take control of one of the branches of government. And with an opposition-controlled assembly, they could theoretically work to reinstate term limits, veto Maduro's legislative choices, and stand as a force against a party that had been running the country since 1999. While the opposition won an overwhelming majority of the seats in Congress, the government has refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Congress for supposedly buying votes in the state of Amazonas. This refusal to recognize legitimacy was the straw that broke the camel's back for opositores. President Maduro subsequently called for the creation of not only a national communal parliament, but also for the Supreme Court, which is controlled by Chavistas, to take over the powers of the Senate. Opositores would not stand for the outrageous abuses of power any longer, and the protests that had begun to diminish began to intensify. With inflation and murder rates at an all-time high, unlivable wages, total media censorship, scarcity of food, medicine, and toiletries, Venezuelans decided that enough was enough, and what had started as peaceful protest and demonstrations has turned into near civil war. Protests have been going on for the last 3 months, and the government has started to resort to cruel and oftentimes lethal tactics to quell protesters. There are videos upon videos of protesters being pelted by marbles, subjected to tear gas, and fearing the Venezuelan armed forces. And the country is experiencing unseen levels of mass migrations as people try and go anywhere to escape not only the repressive political regime, but also the horrible economy and scarcity of resources.
Ya mañana es el día, tu maleta tan listas. Debes llegar por lo menos 4 horas ante al aeropuerto Simón Bolívar. No concilias.
Right now, one of the biggest things you can do to help out Venezuelans is to spread awareness about what's going on. Another thing you can do is donate. Donate to the medical services in Venezuela. Send food. Send bandages. Send clothing. Send money. The people who are protesting in the streets are getting critically injured every day, and the hospitals in the country simply do not have the resources to be treating the volume of people being injured at the present moment. The situation has been going on since 2013, and it's only now, 4 years later, that the situation is beginning to get the media attention that it deserves. Venezuelans only know what's happening when someone shares on social media, because the news stations in Venezuela will not report on protests. And these things happening are important not just for Venezuela, but they're important because the things that Venezuela is currently experiencing are situations that have occurred time and time and time again throughout the history of Latin America, from Argentina to Chile to Brazil to Cuba. There are patterns in history that we refuse to learn from, refuse to recognize, and refuse to believe can affect us as well.